the internal organs and anatomy of a Trolanga. Good day or evening, dear viewer. Today we will be exploring the internal anatomy and organs of a Trolanga and the differences they have from humans. We will be starting from the head and slowly working our way down the body as we progress, explaining each area's differences in detail. And with that summary out of the way, we can begin. Starting with the head, there are quite a few differences from a human. Firstly, the sides of the skull are thicker and stronger, mainly around the Praetorian area, which in humans is known for being the weakest part of the skull. Secondly, the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone and the parts it connects to are larger and thicker, and the zygomatic arch itself extends further away from the skull and is wider to accommodate more jaw muscle. Thirdly, the jaw and upper jaw have several times more bone density than a human, making them much more durable. Why will be explained in a minute. Fourthly, the actual teeth inside the mouth are human-like in placement but are carnivorous in nature. The front teeth possess sharp edges like guillotine blades used for cutting meat. The middle teeth have hooked points for stabbing and tearing meat, and the molars in the back of the mouth are mostly flat, but have edges for crushing bone and a slightly raised front for gripping. Fifthly, the jaw possesses much more muscle, which assists in breaking open the bones of prey to access the nutritious bone marrow inside, and to crush up bones into small pieces for eating. The jaw having higher bone density, which I mentioned earlier, also makes the jaw less likely to break when biting with full force. But the main reason for this muscle and bone difference is that they have an exoskeleton and an endoskeleton, so they need to eat a lot of calcium, which bones have a lot of. Sixthly, the face has 4 mandibles, 2 attached to the cheekbones and 2 attached to the jaw. These mandibles are used primarily for picking scraps of meat off bone, pulling meat out of shells, and for making unique vocalizations. Seventhly, inside the roof of the mouth are 2 rows of short, flexible, and retractable curved keratin needle-like teeth. These teeth were originally solid and non-retractable and could move back and forth, and were used by their ancient ancestors to swallow small life prey, but they were also used for communicating by making clicking noises, which were made by running the tongue over them. But as the Trolanga species evolved, these teeth quickly became unnecessary and were relegated to being just another way to communicate, losing their rigidity and movement, but gaining the ability to retract into the roof of the mouth and emerge when needed. Eighthly, the face of the Trolanga has a retractable extra layer of specialized skin, with cartilage parts that can cover the whole face. This layer is special in that it lets air in and out, keeps dust and dirt out during sandstorms, lets in enough light to not hinder vision too badly, and hides identical facial features from predators like the eyes. The cartilage also adding a rocky, bumpy texture similar to their exoskeletons, making them blend in among rocks almost perfectly. Has a pattern across it that is unique for each individual as a way to identify one another, and it has a special chromatophores in the cheek areas that change color based on emotion, but not during times of fear, so it won't counter its own camouflage. The skin layer also evolved around the time that their ancestors started to leave the temperate cave areas and explore the dry, sandy, rocky, and hot surface, mainly to look for caves. Ninthly, the hair growing from the scalp is not normal hair. Each individual strand is a hollow needle capable of delivering a powerful neurotoxin. This toxic needle is a residual survival trait that evolved in their very early ancestors to deter predators around their size. But now it mostly keeps parasites out of their hair, but this toxin is still very deadly. The Trolanga body is also immune to its own neurotoxins, but if the hair is somehow lost, the body will lose its resistance and eventually become vulnerable to it. Exactly why is unknown, but from what we do know, it has something to do with the immune system, liver, and kidneys, seemingly forgetting how to break down or remove the toxin. And the symptoms of this toxin are the following: paralysis of the nervous system, muscles seizing up, internal bleeding, rapid organ failure, and in some cases, seizures, hallucinations, or even a complete loss of bowel and bladder control. And 10thly, Trolanga do not have external ears. Instead, they have a simple hole leading directly to the eardrum, with a layer of skin hiding the hole. But to counter the reduction in hearing ability that this would cause, they have several hollow tubes filled with liquid in their skulls around the ear that connect to a specialist part of the eardrum. These tubes are located just under the surface of the bone and are also assisted by small sensory hairs on the surface that send additional sound information. These tubes and hairs basically turn the sides of the Trolanga head into ears, giving them elevated hearing. This unusual method of hearing evolved due to their ancestors coming from caves, and the fact that caves tend to absorb a lot of sound. And with that, we have covered the head. We shall now move on to the neck. But surprisingly, unlike the head, the neck has only a few differences. Firstly, the neck bones, and the entire internal spine for that matter, has greatly increased bone density, making it harder for predators to break the spine and paralyze them. Secondly, the outside of the neck, just like the rest of the body, is covered in a protective exoskeleton, but due to the mobility requirements of the neck, these plates of armor are partially infused with keratin to make them more flexible, giving the neck the same range of movement as a human. And thirdly, the esophagus of the Trolanga is lined with small, sharp keratin teeth that shred swallowed food into finer parts, making it easier to digest. These spikes are also a residual trait from their ancestors who used to swallow live prey, but due to these spikes refining the digestive process, they have remained mostly unchanged. And with that, we have covered the neck. Now we shall move on to the lungs, which will have very few differences from humans. First being that they have 50% more air sacs in the alveolar of their lungs and 25% more alveolar throughout their lungs, giving them more blood oxygen to fuel their bodies properly. But as a result, the alveolar are much closer together and separated by much thinner lung tissue, making the risk of a punctured lung much greater if they sustain a chest injury. And secondly, the lung tissue is more dense, durable, and elasticated to compensate for the lack of tissue between the alveolar. And with that, we have covered the lungs. We will now move on to an organ that is unique to Trolanga anatomy, the puff glands. These glands are tiny, specialized clumps of cells that are connected to the endocrine and nervous system and are found throughout the entire body. When stress hormones are released, then they get a specific signal from the brain regarding fight or flight, or just ordered by the Trolanga. These special glands will use a unique chemical process we do not fully understand to either expand the body or shrink it to a limited extent by manipulating the body's density. How these glands in the Trolanga evolved to do this exactly is unknown, but previous ancestors of the Trolanga have a similar system they can use to do the same thing, except this involves air sacs inside the body that inflates using oxygen pulled from the blood, and deflate by giving it back to the red blood cells, which absorb oxygen from said air sacs the same way they would from the lungs, albeit this deflating process tends to be rather slow and can take several minutes. But despite not knowing how said glands evolved in the Trolanga, we do know why they evolved, that being to intimidate and scare off predators around the same size as them, like what a pufferfish does, or to make them smaller and harder to hit, and to make it easier to squeeze into gaps that a pursuing predator cannot fit into. And with that, we have covered the puff glands. We shall now move on to the heart. The heart of a Trolanga itself is a standard with no real difference. But unlike humans, the Trolanga don't just have one, they also have two simple hearts, one on each side of the body near the main heart. These two simple hearts exist entirely just to pump blood to the wings, keeping them alive, and are connected to the arterial system just like the main heart. And with the heart covered, we shall now move on to the circulatory system, which only has one actual difference, that being specialist rings of muscle near every major joint which will slam close when a body part is lost to prevent blood loss, a similar system to what earth spiders have. This specific trait evolved from their very, very ancient ancestors and has been kept around since then, as a lot of predators in the Trolanga homeworld often go for their prey's limbs to cripple them for an easy kill. And with the circulatory system covered, we shall now move on to the stomach. This organ in particular only has 4 differences from the human stomach. Firstly, the stomach of Trolanga produces a powerful stomach acid capable of digesting rotting flesh, bone, and killing most foodborne illnesses. Secondly, their stomach has a unique set of muscles that move the stomach in a way that stirs its contents, aiding digestion. Thirdly, the lower section of the stomach has a set of flat keratin molars and muscles that crush up remaining solids before food passes to the intestines. And fourthly, the stomach walls are much more durable and thicker, allowing them to withstand sharp bone fragments. All of these traits, except the first one, are from their ancestors, but not from the ones that swallow live prey. They actually came from a very ancient arthropod-like ancestor, predating the ones that ate live prey. dating all the way back to when close circulatory arthropods became the dominant form of life on their planet. But that is a story for another day. Also, the first traits, on the other hand, is from the ones that did eat live prey. But anyway, with the stomach covered, we shall now move on to the liver, which surprisingly only has one difference. That being that it breaks down the neurotoxins produced within the hair if it enters the bloodstream, turns it into its base elements, and gives them back to the body. And with the liver covered, we shall now move on to the small intestines, which only have a few differences from the human ones. First being, much like the stomach, they're thicker and more durable. And secondly, much like the esophagus, they're aligned with small, sharp keratin teeth to break down any soft and partly digested bones that may remain. This trait is also from their live prey-eating ancestors. And with the small intestines covered, we shall now move on to the kidneys, which also only have a few differences. Firstly, the Cholanga body possesses 2 kidneys like a human, but these kidneys are 20% larger and on average have 2 more renal medullas, which in turn houses more nephrons, glomerulus, and tubule, which give them more filtration. This adaptation exists because their diet tends to be rich in vitamins like B12, which too much of can cause poisoning. Secondly, much like the liver, the kidneys have the ability to filter the hair toxin out of the body, but instead of breaking it down or reusing the resources, they simply disarm the toxin and send it to the bladder. The process of deactivating the toxin mostly works, but on average, 2 to 5% of the hair toxin in the blood that gets filtered out by the kidneys and passed out in urine will remain undisarmed, which brings up an interesting side fact. Doctors on the Cholanga homeworld would often check the percentage in urine samples as a way of detecting kidney failure very early. And thirdly, the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys are 30% bigger. This is so that they can meet the body's need for hormone and metabolic regulation and produce enough adrenaline to fuel the body in times of a crisis. And with the kidneys covered, we shall now move on to the bladder, which only has one difference, that being it can actually reabsorb moisture during times of extreme dehydration to keep the body alive. But this process will make the urine much thicker and denser and harder to pass. Not only that, but if the dehydration continues for too long, the urine will eventually become too thick to pass properly, which will lead to buildup of waste and toxin in the body, and if untreated, will eventually lead to kidney failure and death. And with the bladder covered, we shall now move on to the large intestines and rectum, which will have the same differences as the small intestines, being thicker, more durable, and lined with keratin teeth. But unlike the small intestine, these teeth are a bit larger and exist for 2 reasons. Those reasons being to break down any remaining solids and to rip apart any parasites or things that try to get in. An example of things that try to get in is a species of soft-body, semi-parasitic worms known as pulpacavarer, which essentially translates to weak hole intruder. Also, just a heads up before we continue, I'm about to talk about an intestinal parasite, so if you don't want to hear about that, just skip to the bone marrow and bones section. These parasites spend a majority of their life underground and basically live the same as worms on Earth. That is, until they mate in the summer. After mating, the pregnant female worm will wait till nightfall, emerge from the ground, and find a sleeping target, which is often livestock as they have no intestinal teeth, and spray their target's anus with a numbing agent produced from a gland in the parasite's mouth and make their way inside. Once inside, the female will latch onto the intestinal wall and lay thousands of tiny eggs, and then simply leave. The eggs, on the other hand, will hatch within a few days, and the newly born worms will leach nutrients from the host body for several weeks before growing big enough to leave and survive on their own. Yet, unfortunately, the mere presence of these parasites will often lead to most host animals suffering from diarrhea, itching, and abdominal pain. But luckily, most of these parasites get killed and eaten and digested by smaller carnivorous animals before they can reproduce, keeping their population in check. But with that covered, we shall now move on to the bone marrow and bones, which has 2 major differences. First being that the skeletal system of a Cholanga is much higher in bone density and is much stronger as a result. And the second being that the body's healing factor, which is a process I need to actually explain in detail. The bone marrow of the Cholanga functions similarly to human bone marrow, producing immune cells to guard the body and stem cells for healing. But unlike human bone marrow, Cholanga bone marrow has specialist memory cells dedicated entirely to regeneration, similar to the memory cells in plants that help them regrow after being trimmed. When a limb is lost, these memory cells will also create copies of themselves and send them to the site of injury to oversee the regeneration process. Once the regeneration process is complete, the memory cell copies will return to the original memory cells, compare finished body part to what was intended, and make corrections if necessary. And when the body part is done, the cloned memory cells will commit apoptosis as they no longer have purpose. But this regeneration process can take a while and requires a lot of calories to fuel, and is dependent on what body part was actually lost, how big it was, and the regenerative ability of the Trolanga in question. But generally, a Trolanga can regenerate a limb in 3 to 4 Earth weeks, but we have no idea what that translates to on their homeworld. This could easily be days, weeks, months, or years, etc. Also, on a side note related to the healing, the Trolanga body has a never-ending supply of an enzyme similar to telomerase, which works to keep regenerating the telomeres of the chromosomes, preventing genetic damage over time, which fundamentally allows them to live indefinitely, more accurately, until they're either killed by something or themselves, which has a massive impact on how their society works, but that is for another video. But anyway, why evolve this? Because as I mentioned in the circulatory system parts, predators tend to target the limbs, so evolving to regenerate these limbs makes you less likely to get killed in the long run, and by evolving to live for a very long time, it gives you more opportunity to have kids. Also, for a quick clarification, the second adaptation and the telomerase thing both came from the same ancestors that evolved the circulatory closing muscle systems. And with that, those are the anatomical differences between a Trolanga and a human. But before you go, I have a few things I need to mention. You may have noticed that I did not explain the genitalia, brain, nervous system, telepathic abilities, which are mentioned in the Gospel and how their wings work. Well, that's because they're rather expansive, detailed topics which will need their own videos to explain properly. And on a related note, there was a type of implant that used to be available on the Trolanga homeworld that would greatly affect the biology and culture at one point, but we cannot discuss that here, as it also needs its own entire video to explain properly. But anyway, if you want to learn more about the Trolanga species and their biology, world, and culture, subscribe, click the bell, and set notifications to full and stay tuned. See you next time, and goodbye.